Several decades ago, there were two dictations that were delivered by our beloved Gautama Buddha, and we draw on those teachings and lessons from him today. The two dictations, the first one we can consider as a benediction on peace, as it was given to humanity by beloved Gautama. And the second we can potentially look at as an ordered delivered in the form of a warning. Now, these were delivered basically a generation apart. The first one was on August the 3rd, 1958, and the second was on February the 6th, 1983. And in both of those, Gautama is addressing the same subject, world peace, from what amounts to two ends of a single argument. Now, in our teaching here today, I will attempt to treat the two dictations as a matched pair rather than as two isolated dictations. And from that, we can then draw the perception that peace is a gift which cannot be imposed, it can only be accepted. It was first proposed with confidence in 1958, and then Gautama re-argued more urgently and at a greater cost in 1983. And we can extend that out from 1983 to today. We can see as we've gone through our rituals this morning, the peace is not something that is created outside of us. We must first experience that peace within us. And that is the gist of Gautama's teaching to us. And we will turn to many of his words. So the two dictations that we're drawing from was published in Pearls of Wisdom, Volume 1, number 2, and then also Volume 26, number 6. So before either dictation makes an ethical demand of its listeners, it first supplies us with a picture of where human beings or humanity is standing in relation to divine order. And here I'll share how Gautama's words and how he expresses that. And he talks here first about how the ascended host is connected to our Father, Mother God, to Alpha and Omega. So let's hear his words. He says, through the victory of our personal ascension, each of us who abides here in the ascended master octaves of light knows the magnificence of the original God pattern created by Alpha and Omega. This God pattern is stepped down by the great silent watcher, the cosmic Christ and beloved Helios and Vesta, God and Goddess of this solar system. For every life stream our Father, Mother God have sent forth from the central sphere of white fire perfection, the first cause. From the point of first cause in the beginning with the word in Brahman, the white fire bodies of twin flames were created out of the immaculate concept of their God parents. And there in the spiritual sun, behind the physical central sun, they first appeared. The original glory of the creation of the white fire bodies of twin flames was and still is just so magnificent, the perfection thereof being eternally beheld in the mind of God. The white fire body is the individualized I am presence, the central sphere of the causal body that is draped in the electronic fire rings of the five secret rays of the Buddhic consciousness. This divine monad is then surrounded by colored bands of the seven rays as illustrated on the chart of presence. So rapid is the rate of vibration of the pure light essence of the white fire body and the five-fold translucent, pastel, crystalline sheaths that it is quite impossible for that purity of the Buddhic mind to be interfered with by any shadow of human creation. for such shadows would be instantly and completely transmuted into light's perfection, having no sustaining power of their own in the presence of God. So, as we hear Gautama's words, this establishes for us, as we are in embodiment, not merely psychological and social units, but it reminds us that we are indeed sparks of a larger, structured, and orderly cosmos, one in which perfection is the default state. And it is corrupted only by, in Gautama's words, any shadow of human creation. Now, in the 1958 dictation, Gautama described what the human being fundamentally is. And then 25 years later, in the 1983 dictation, Gautama describes where we as human beings are permitted to act, and crucially, where the ascended host is not permitted to act. Now, Buddha speaks of the footstool kingdom, drawn from Isaiah's image of heaven as God's throne and earth as his footstool. So let me just go back to that. Buddha speaks of the footstool kingdom, drawn from Isaiah's image of heaven as God's throne and earth as his footstool, to characterize earth as a domain of testing rather than a domain of automatic perfection, a place, in Buddha's words, where dwell all types of humanity, where unsolved patterns and karmic ties accumulate and must eventually come before the lords of karma for adjustment. Now, as we go through and we look at the dictation, Gautama focuses in the 1958 dictation on geography. Buddha does not simply announce peace in the abstract. He locates it ceremonially in a specific city at a specific structure. He states plainly that he has established a great focus of peace in Washington, D.C., the same quality of peace, he says, that flows forth through the mountains and valleys of Tibet. And he describes the act in almost liturgical terms, touching, in the name of Almighty God, the pinnacle of the Capitol Dome, and that is Gautama sending forth his light and his love through Washington, D.C., so that his radiation may be carried outward through the goddess of freedom statue positioned atop of it. And I must be honest, when first of all, as I was preparing for our service today, and I read that, I did not know that there was, or that there is, a goddess of freedom statue on top of the dome of our capital, of the Capitol Dome. So that was a lesson for me to learn. This is peace conceived not as sentiment, this peace that Gautama is talking about, but as a kind of spiritual infrastructure. And it is deliberately cited at the physical center of our nation's governing power. And now let's hear Gautama's specific words in relation to this. He says, therefore, in the name of Almighty God, and by his power vested in me, I am touching with my hand the pinnacle of the dome of the Capitol of these United States. And my radiation, so released through the goddess of freedom, whose statue is positioned aloft, shall be felt all across this nation today. All light shall guide this nation into its eternal perfection, as long as its people will hold fast to the love of God, to the love of peace and freedom, and to their faith in the invisible hand of the great white brotherhood, from which has come forth all that is visible. Hold up the cup of your consciousness to me this day, and receive all I can and shall give you. For I speak not often, I assure you, that my love, for while I speak not often, I assure you that my love is always flowing out to bless all life, particularly those who will consciously accept it, as I hold eternal vigilance before the throne of the Almighty. And I think we all are open and receiving the beautiful love and perfection that Gautama and the ascended host send us. Now, what makes Gautama's dictation significant is a statement such as the blessing that is dispensed with total impartiality. The love and light released, Buddha says, pour out impersonally, yet personally, knowing no caste, creed, or race. It is extended without regard as to the worthiness or unworthiness of any part of life to receive this blessing. Gautama gives us a highly specific, almost territorial act of consecration, joined to a claim of total universality in whom it benefits. So it's impersonally, yet personally, and knowing no caste, creed, or race, and it extends without regard as to the worthiness or unworthiness of any part of life to receive that blessing. Now, my opinion is the choice of Washington here is, or Washington in DC, is strategic. And in the dictation, Gautama explains it as a response to the needs of Eastern trained souls now embodied in the West. Rather than exclusive, the grace anchored there is offered to all life. And we can consider that the geography is the delivery mechanism, not the message's boundary. However, we know from the work the masters have delivered and what God guides us to is that it is specific to America in this particular instance as the great experiment in freedom, but that the vibration and the energy of the blessing reaches far beyond our shores, far beyond the capital in Washington, D.C., and far beyond the shores of America. Now, in 1958, Gautama states it as an assurance. He says, if the children of God are ever to find permanent peace either within or around themselves, it will be because they have once again turned their attention to their own I am presence. Now, note the qualifying phrase, within or around, which quietly denies that outer and inner peace are separable achievements. Outer peace, on this account, is downstream of an inward turn. Peace outwardly cannot be produced by policy, treaty, or even by a great focus ceremonially planted over a capital city. The focus can be offered, the turning must be chosen. In other words, we, as the humanity receiving the message from Gautama, and not just from Gautama Buddha, but from every master, if we listen or we read every dictation that has been given, and there are volumes of published dictations, the message there is everything that we want to see in the world around us, including peace and love and wisdom and the power of God, must come from within. We cannot manifest it in the outer if it is not first manifested and created and there within ourselves, within our hearts. So the focus can be offered, the turning inward to manifest it there must be chosen. And then 25 years later, in the 1964 dictation, Gautama again brings the same message, but stripped of ceremony, and it's delivered almost as a diagnosis. And here are Gautama's words. He says, "There is no outer peace until mankind achieve an inner tranquility and quietude within themselves. So long as the causes are generated from within the feeling and the thinking of mankind's old and ancestral thirst for vengeance, it cannot be that turmoil shall cease." And I'm going to read that one more time. There is no outer peace until mankind achieve an inner tranquility and quietude within themselves. So long as the causes are generated from within the feeling and thinking of mankind's old and ancestral thirst for vengeance, it cannot be that turmoil shall cease. And Gautama continues and he says, "And yet the heart of heaven decrees it so. The ascended masters of light decree it so, and all who serve our cause seek and pursue it mightily." Now, Gautama's 1983 formulation of his message is worth pausing on, precisely because it is so close to a restatement of that earlier dictation in which he made that statement. Now, this is not a new teaching, but the same teaching tested against a quarter century of results and found still true, perhaps now proven true by the absence of the peace it predicted. And if we look at our world, we go from 1958, when that original dictation happened, to 1983, and then we look at our world today. Do we have truly peace? Yes. People are yearning for it, but we often forget that we need to be at peace within ourselves. We need to have that peace that, as Jesus said, surpasses all understanding. And once we achieve that tranquility within ourselves, we then are able to bring that out into the outer world. And God, the masters, are there with us, and they will help us to manifest that as it is needed. Now, where the 1958 line is phrased as what I would consider an invitation with a happy conditional, in other words, Gautama said that it will be because, in the 1983 line, it is phrased as a causal law with no ceremony attached. No outer peace until inner peace is established. We cannot have outer peace in the world around us until we manifest the peace within ourselves. And then we start exuding that and expanding it out. Gautama's words were somewhat harsher in 1983. And if you read those two dictations together, you'll find that in the beginning, and the first pearl that we're pulling on that dictation from was the second pearl in the publishing lifetime of the Pearls of Wisdom here with Summit Lighthouse. And it was the second dictation, I believe, that was given through beloved Mark Prophet. So at that point in time, the masters were giving us a more happy, conditional phrase, an invitation, and then a couple of decades later, based on the conditions that we manifested in the outer, then there was a harsher message. And yet it is filled, even though it sounds that Gautama's words are harsher in that 1983 dictation, it is filled with the deep love, the love of God for his wayward children dwelling on earth. And when I read that, and I read Gautama's words to us, of the love of God. We can think of our own children, and I think of my children and my grandson. And no matter, well, I wouldn't say no matter what they do, I will always love my children unconditionally. I won't always like what they do. And I think sometimes we, in our um, grossness here in the physical embodiment, forget that the love of God, is there with us always. We are his wayward children dwelling here in the earth, and we're not always following the path towards perfection that we originally agreed to come in to this embodiment for. So, Gautama's words, somewhat harsher, yet filled with that reminder of the deep love, the love of God for us as his children, as his sons and daughters here, dwelling on earth. And his words frames for us a pathway, again, toward that achievable blessing. And in the 1983 dictation, Gautama explained why the blessing has largely not been achieved. So we'll take a look at that as well as we go through and read further from his words. So the dictation in 1958 delivers a beautiful discourse in which Gautama describes a significant portion of that included the beautiful lesson on the theme of peace. But it came from the perspective of how did the ascended masters come to be what and where they are. And Buddha's answer is that ascension was achieved through a totalizing devotion. A totalizing devotion. And we know that if we want to achieve our ascension, there are specific cosmic laws, natural laws, that we must follow and abide by. And one of those is finding that tranquility and peace within us, that we are not moved by every single thing that happens in this world. Just think about it. If we are shifted every single time that we encounter a some horrible thing in the news, etc., rather than going internal. And believe me, I have had to practice that substantially. If we can just be tranquil and at peace, make the calls, and hand it over to the masters and to our beloved Father, Mother God, to Alpha and Omega, to Helios and Vesta, we have this tremendous privilege where we can be make the call here and understand that we are not making the call. We are at peace and tranquil within ourselves, and that call we allow to flow through us, and the masters work through us, and eventually that peace and tranquility and the upheavals and the catastrophes are resolved within this physical world that we are in. Now, ascension, as Gautama describes it, is understood not as a reward bestowed from outside, but it is the natural consequence of sustained, voluntary self surrender to a higher pattern that is already latent within us individually. And we just connect with our I am presence and our Holy Christ self. We stay constantly and constance and consistently, is the word I'm looking for, connected with Gautama, with Jesus, with our beloved Saint Germain. Now, this claim is inseparable in the dictation from the second question, whether the ascended masters have, in fact, died. And that is a question that Gautama addresses in that second dictation that was published in volume 1, number 2. But Buddha treats the charge directly when he states this: mankind, observing this complete surrender of the outer self, has concluded that we are among the dead, when in fact the masters have merely surrendered our human wills and lesser expressions while becoming absorbed into the pattern of divine perfection. I'm going to read that one more time. I just think that the words in which Gautama expressed that is so beautiful and so enlightening for us to understand. Very simplistic terms, to understand what we need to do to attain eventually our own ascension. So his words are, mankind, observing this complete surrender of the outer self, has concluded that we are among the dead, when in fact the masters have merely surrendered our human wills and lesser expressions while becoming absorbed into the pattern of divine perfection. Now we can confirm then within our minds and hearts that a peace focus anchored at the capital only means something if its source is understood to be a living, attentive presence rather than a historical memory. Now, Gautama also turns to instruction in these dictations. The charge given to all people of America is twofold. First, he says, forsake the realm of action of the human ego. And second, he says, to hold the immaculate concept of God's perfect creation for yourselves and others. So forsake the realm of action of human ego and hold the immaculate concept of God's perfect creation for yourselves and others. Gautama states, it is absolutely essential for all of you to forsake the realm of action of the human ego. It is absolutely essential for all of you to look beyond the mere outer expression of personality and to hold the immaculate concept of God's perfect creation for yourselves and others. Now, the phrase immaculate concept names a disciplined act of perception, a decision to see, our decision, our choice, to see the ideal uncorrupted pattern in another person, even where present behavior contradicts it. And I'll be honest, for me, that's sometimes a little difficult, but I'm working on it. This is presented as the practical mechanism by which permanent world peace moves from principle to manifestation, not through political reform in the first instance, but through a shift in how we, as individuals and collectively, habitually perceive one another and how we manifest that peace internally. Just think about it. If we can, as a nation, come together and feel and be that peace, that tranquility, and for a minute hold that in our minds, that concept, that visual, how incredibly will we then be able to expand that out from within our hearts, out into the world, and see the peace that everyone is so yearning for manifested in the physical world. Now, Gautama also grounds this apparent abstract discipline in something intimate and accessible. And he says, an assurance that right within your beating heart, there exists a replica of the secret place of the Most High, a divine storehouse of love, wisdom, and power sufficient to sustain a person through any and all crises. And isn't that a beautiful thought? Right within your beating heart, there exists a replica of the secret place of the Most High, a divine storehouse of love, wisdom, and power. Gautama continues and he shares this. He says, many came and were given the gift of free will, and there was trepidation even in heaven concerning some of these as to whether or not they would rightly employ it. And it came to pass that they did not. For the old momentums which they knew in past eras came once again to them for redemption. And they stood face to face with the dweller upon the threshold of their own being. And he was not consumed, but he emerged with all of his own bestial trappings to cause the world around to be a jungle where the dissonance and the cries of anguish could be heard. Now, I'll add this here before I continue with Gautama's words. In the second dictation, the volume 26, number 2, at the end of it, there is a beautiful description of, and I call it beautiful because it is, the wording and everything is so clear, of the dweller on the threshold. For anyone who wants a reminder of exactly what that represents, I would encourage you to go and read that in the prole. Now, from the two dictations by Gautama, we can assert that the first was a teaching on what has been given, and the second is a teaching on what has been squandered. Gautama says, the seeds of unrest and turmoil planted by disturbing individuals and recalcitrant mankind are scattered abroad upon the land and upon the world, and the harvest of unrighteousness is perilous unto all mankind. So when we look at it from that perspective, if peace requires an inward turning that each individual must choose, then unrest, by the same logic, is the visible fruit of a great many individual choices not to turn inward and manifest that peace inward. Choices, the hierarchy bound by its own obedience to cosmic law, and those are Gautama's words, is explicitly said to be unable to override. And we know the hierarchy, the ascended host, the Great White Brotherhood, cannot undo for us what we have created. That is our karmic debt that we must transmute. And a little bit later on, Gautama does refer to the violet flame. Now, in the dictation 1964, which was aptly titled Seeds of Unrest, Gautama identifies so-called spiritual brethren who would take advantage of every opportunity where turmoil is generated in the world to cast abroad and scatter seeds of fear and distrust, describing such figures as children of pestilence. And that's Gautama's description. Children of pestilence, fully complicit with the terror mongers, notwithstanding that they esteem themselves to be children of light. Now, the indictment is notable for its precision and the words that Gautama uses in that particular dictation. The failure identified is not disbelief, but a corrupted use of belief. Spiritual language deployed for the acquisition of influence or profit rather than in service of the peace it claims to represent. And that is the so-called spiritual brethren who are taking advantage of people who believe, but now they have been led astray by those who they are following. So Gautama continues and he says, the perils that faced the elect faced also those lesser beings responsible. And in the midst of all, the elect sought to uphold their own equilibrium, assisting mankind in all of their discord and troubles, while seeking to find their own way back to freedom's bastions. As we recall struggles which are not known to you in the outer, as we recall now conditions of which you are not apprised as yet, as we see the graphs of the future outlined and predicated by the actions of mankind today, and as we take into cognizance the drawings and tracings upon the screen of life from past civilizations, we solemnly warn mankind that if they shall continue to pursue the path of righteousness and ignorance, that ignorance which does ignore the gift of life and takes into account but the narrow provincialism of their own thoughts and feelings, I assure you that they shall reap a frightful harvest indeed. And then further in the dictation, Gautama says, it is not enough for mankind to dabble in spiritual matters while their lives are lived in shame. Vultures they are when they take the treasures of God and do expend them upon their own vanity. The sheer neglect that has been practiced by the so-called Christian and Buddhic world, and I say shame upon both of them in this aspect, is one of disregard to the very holy tenets for which mankind ascended, did give their all. Now I do not speak to bring a weight and cloud of further condemnation upon mankind, even though my words seem to be themselves a pall of criticism. I speak to bring the light of truth to the world, ere it crumble over the brink of destruction and find itself unable to cope with the frightful conditions which will be brought about unless there is a stopping of the action of human discord and filth. And those are harsh words. But as Gautama says, he's not bringing those words to us to condemn us, but to awaken within us the understanding that unless we each individually and collectively change our ways, there is destruction on its way. Now, Buddha warns that if humanity continues to pursue the pathway of righteousness and ignorance, it shall reap a frightful harvest indeed. And he says, and some of what I'm going to read here is a repeat of what I have already read and said, but I invite you to listen with attention to our beloved Gautama's words. He says, we ask you to hold supreme confidence in the ultimate victory of the holy cause. But we say to you and presage our advice with faith in the ultimate outcome, that unless mankind shall awaken from the vampire-like sleep in which they presently exist, paying allegiance to a multitude of lesser gods than themselves, who, by reason of their negatively spiritual qualities in high places, do tear man down into the degenerative cycle. Gautama says, I cannot promise the world the freedom which God has in store in this generation. So if we continue down the road of destruction, Gautama says he cannot promise the world the freedom which God has in store for this generation. It was that generation at that time. We have multiple other generations that have come into embodiment since then. And I think it is a responsibility for us to ensure that we are the tranquil, at peace within our hearts, that we allow the masters to work through us and to bring that peace and that transmutation and transformation into the world around us. Gautama says, and I fear lest the torch be passed to another generation to achieve that which this one shall fail to outpicture, then there will be the definite and conclusion of it, which is destruction. Now, the message Gautama brought decades ago still rings clear today, as I've now mentioned a number of times during this teaching in this lesson. The seeds of unrest sown by individual free will are no longer framed merely as an obstacle to inner peace, but it has become a civilizational hazard, with a named precedent for what unchecked discord can ultimately produce. And we can see that in our world today. All we need to do is open our eyes and our ears in this world today. But there is always a solution for it. If we, in embodiment, would just choose to turn inward, to stand in the light of God and in the love of God. Now, the 1958 dictation's confident talk on approaching a golden age, and Gautama speaks of the potential of us bringing in a golden age in our lifetimes. It is countered with the possibility, however reluctantly Gautama stated it, that no such age arrives on schedule or that it arrives at all for the generation that we are in, unless we change our ways. So and I just for a moment here go a little bit off track here. We have our karmic board novena that we do every single day. And we invite all our hearts, whether you join us on the broadcast at 8 p.m. every single day, or you give it on your own. And if we give it at different hours during the day, we have this continuous calls that we're making to bring transformation and transfiguration in place into this world of ours. And that is a small thing that I think that the masters are asking us. We who know, who have that knowledge, sometimes we may feel knowing what is potentially going to come and what is happening in the world is not always for us a comfortable thing to work with, but it is what we chose to be here for. And as long as we apply ourselves and we do it based on the teachings and the cosmic law that Gautama and all the masters continuously and consistently shares with us in their teachings, we do have the opportunity to turn things around and bring in that golden age. Now, Gautama repeats the request that recurs like a refrain. We ask you to try. These are Gautama's words. He says, we ask you to try for the sake of the hierarchy. We ask you to try for the sake of your beloved Saint Germain. We ask you to try for the sake of the angelic host. And we ask you to try for the sake of beloved Immaculata. The naming is deliberate and relational rather than abstract. So, beloved Gautama naming the hierarchy, and beloved Saint Germain, who is our hierarch for this coming golden age and the Aquarian age. If we can do whatever we need to do, try as hard as we can, and actually manifest peace internally and then externally, then we can turn around the direction of where our world is going at this time. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Gautama also reminds us of the power of the violet flame. And he says, as Lord of the world, it is my will, as it is also the will, the Buddha, the beloved Lord Maitreya, the Buddha, the beloved Lord Maitreya, and of the entire Great White Brotherhood, that all flesh should be saved. Yes, even transmuted into purity and perfection once again, sublimated in spirit and purified in substance by the application of the merciful violet flame. Gautama says, beloved ones, take advantage of the many opportunities that are offered you today by the ascended host, and as never before, seize upon the idea of the perfection of your mighty I Am presence and its practical manifestation right here in this world of form. And let's heed beloved Gautama's words. And Gautama is not the only one who keeps reminding us of the power of the merciful violet flame. Now, beloved Gautama closes both dictations with blessings, and it is my privilege to read those to you. The first one is from volume 1, number 2, and that dictation by beloved Gautama, and he says, peace, peace, peace I give to you. Expand, oh, expand it. Hold it, sustain, and expand it. My peace I leave with you. Oh, love it, and therefore keep it. And then from the second dictation, the beautiful poem, O angels of cosmic peace, thy radiance brings to all release. From vanity and discontent until thy grace, perfectionment, is known by all and loved with all, and shadows dissolved, human creation all, and God is seen as raiment white, adorning all with heaven's light. I am thy peace, thy God control, thy victory, O living soul. Come then and feel the wisdom flame, released by God's own I Am name, that shall enfold the substance rare, the blossoms of God's love so fair, and cleanse the earth by purity, and flood each soul till all shall be ascended and forever free. Beloved Gautama, we are so grateful for your teaching here today, and we are blessed beyond understanding to be able to actually partake of these. Thank you, Father. Thank you, beloved Alpha and Omega, beloved Helios and Vesta, beloved Saint Germain, and beloved Jesus. We are grateful for your presence with us.